It's like OCD, the letters in the right order.
Okay, I gotcha.
Have you seen that show, Mark?
I've watched it on.
Oh yeah, that's amazing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. A smaller crowd for Q&A tonight, but that's okay.
I think everybody's on information overload.
So, just a reminder for everyone, for any of your friends who aren't sticking around for Q&A, this is being recorded and it's going to be up on Facebook, and we're going to try to figure out how to get it from Facebook onto the Crandall website. But at the very least, you let people know this is on the Ratio Christi at Crandall University Facebook page. Ratio Christi at Crandall University. And if you don't know how to spell Ratio Christi, you should by now. It's been up all over the place. But it's on that banner and several other places. But in any case, just wanted to make that plug before we jump in. So, here's the static. I think the mics are too close to the John. Perfect. So, all right, so while we talk in the mic, just hold it to about here. Can everybody hear me okay? Can everyone hear this okay in the mic? Does it sound like it's coming through? Perfect.
I teach in this class, so I normally just I don't use that.
Sound actually part of like everybody. So do you explain format?
Kenzie does.
So, all right, we're good to go?
We're live.
We're live.
So guys, I'd like to thank you all for coming here and making this event an event. I'd also like to thank all the speakers for the time and energy that they've dedicated to coming here today. Now, the way this works is throughout this entire symposium, people have been writing questions and putting them in a box up there, and we've collected all of the, well, basically all of them, and I'll be asking the professors and giving them about 3 to 5-ish minutes on each question. So, the first question is, if the ancient versions of the Hebrew language died out, how did we manage to translate it? So this is, of course, referring to ancient Hebrew and how it's so much different than modern Hebrew. And how did we manage to translate it if it's essentially a dead language? So whoever would like to answer?
Yeah. Well, a lot of that has been, I guess I could use one of these. Normally I just shout. A lot of that, it was passed down generationally from rabbi to rabbi, from elder to elder, that they would know what these texts mean, especially thinking before the time of the Masoretes. They're reading just the consonantal text, no vowels. So they know what it says. They've spent their lifetime building up to this point where they've got the whole thing memorized. They know exactly what it says. Looking at the page is merely a formality, just to keep yourself on track at that point. Or you could be a crazy person like Martin Luther and start off with the manuscripts and teach yourself Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic by literally just trial and error over a couple of years. But most people aren't quite that brilliant.
I think that that very issue was dealt with when we talked about the Masorah and the Masoretes yesterday, where the pronunciation was, the language was being lost, but they had the tradition of the pronunciation. They didn't invent the vowels. They just invented the signs so that the correct pronunciation would be preserved. And we know they're right because we can actually look at transliterations of ancient Hebrew texts, and we know that on the basis of those, that the Masoretic pronunciation is right. We look at them because there are transliterations when they have words, they don't translate place names. They don't translate them. So Sodom, for example, essentially we have those Greek transliterations from the 1st, 2nd, 4th century AD in the Septuagint, and it's Sodom.
Yeah.
So we have those kinds of things that can help us. And even then, we have some of the languages in the 19th century which were we discovered, like the hieroglyphics in that in Egypt we had 3 different we have the Rosetta Stone, and this has nothing to do with Hebrew, but we have 3 different languages together. We knew the 2 of them, and what they sounded like, and we were able that as a result, scholars were able to figure out what the third meant and everything else. Anyway.
Oh, thank you. Oh yeah. So, what would you say is the most misunderstood part of the Old Testament?
Yeah, I used to.
There's so many. One of the ones that I've been reflecting on lately, I guess, I think that the Book of Proverbs has been largely misunderstood by a. Did this just die? No, we're good. I think the Book of Proverbs has largely been misunderstood by a lot of lay people, at the very least, often taken as guarantees for what will happen if we do so and so. So, for example, one of the passages that a lot of parents have been troubled by, and that I hear come up a lot in my ministry, Ratio Christi, is the Proverbs says that if you bring up your children in these teachings to obey the Lord and whatnot, then they'll stick with it when they get older.
Guaranteed.
Guaranteed, yeah. So a lot of people take that proverb as being a guarantee, and so I have friends and I have family members, people very dear to me, who were brought up in the church, and they left. And as I mentioned in my talk earlier today with talking about Ratio Christi and the ministry we do, there's a fall away rate of something like 60 to 90% across the spectrum in North America alone. I'm not going to get into how do we explain that in detail from a theological perspective or whatever, but what I do want to say is there seems to be this conflict between I don't know how else to word that, an interpretation of the Proverbs as guarantees and what actually takes place in reality. So I think that we need to be careful how we understand the Proverbs. They are meant to be, have you ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean? Yes. I think Dan knows where I might be going with this. They're more like guidelines than actual rules. They're there to give us guidance in how to live our lives. And Proverbs weren't just something in the Bible. They were in the ancient world and stuff. So and again, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, so I might be botching the way I'm wording this. But I think it might be fair to say that I don't think the Proverbs are guarantees, are formulaic guarantees that if you do one thing, then this is what's going to happen. I think that they're more like motivational guidelines for, if you want this to happen, these are conditional things if this is going to happen. Not necessarily that if this happens, it's a guarantee. Not necessarily that if you do this, it's a guarantee it's going to happen, but it's a condition of that happening. So that's how I understand the Proverbs, and I think that that's one of the most misunderstood parts of the Old Testament, just because it's often taken as guarantees rather than guidelines.
Dr. Dempster and I had a conversation in the hallway a couple weeks ago. In his Old Testament course, he's taken up part of one of his course texts is Paul Copan's "Is God a Moral Monster?" And I read that book during my MDiv, and then I did a course on Old Testament ethics in my PhD. And the issues surrounding the conquest of the land, treatment of women, treatment of slaves, polygamy, so on and so forth, especially coming from the legal portions, especially in the Pentateuch, and then really just kind of the, sometimes called the Hexateuch, the first 6 books of the Bible. They seem to be real sticking points for a lot of people. And Dr. Dempster and I were having this conversation about how a lot of people, when they're coming here to Crandall, and a lot of people have these questions of, I am told on Reddit and on Facebook and on these various online platforms that the God I worship is this horrible monster, just this cruel and capricious and violent, misogynistic, slave-holding, just tyrant of a being. Is that the God I worship? Or should I default to Marcionism and say that the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament? Because the Old Testament is pretty violent. I won't deny the fact that it is pretty violent. And I think not a lot of people aren't given the interpretive tools to understand a lot of what of that violence, why a lot of that violence is happening, the causes of some of those violence, and God's reactions to a lot of these things, and kind of the cultural backgrounds of what's going on, and understanding the difference between the Bible as descriptive morality and the Bible as prescriptive morality. So when is the Bible saying this is the way you should do things? And when is the Bible saying this is just the way things were done? And not making a comment on its rightness or wrongness. And like Dr. Dempter was in his talk earlier, the former and latter prophets assume that you know Torah already. That is just a priori assumption. So they don't need to say, when they see, oh, this horrible thing is happening in Judges, they don't need to say, this is a horrible thing. They assume, you just finished reading the Torah. You know that this is horrible. I don't need to make comment on that. But without having that Torah as the core of our theology, much of the rest of the violence just looks absolutely abhorrent. And I guess I can't really blame people for that.
All right, so question 3 is, given all the translations of the Bible, which one would be the closest to the original text?
The Message.
Oh.
Don't badmouth Peterson, not right now.
No, the Message is a paraphrase, and it has its use, but it's not a what we would call a Bible translation.
Yes, I'm asked that question a lot by students, and I think any good modern version, English version, is like the RSV, the NIV, ESV. These are all very, very good translations, and we all in translations we all have our weaknesses, and some people like the King James, and it's very interesting when you look at the mindset of the King James translators. It was a very good translation, but it's interesting. You will never find the word tyrant in the King James, and it's obvious because kings are good. Okay, they're not tyrants, and so in the Geneva Bible, which is written around the same time or whatever, you do get the word tyrant used. So it shows that all translators have their agendas and everything else. But I think when these modern versions, modern translations, they try to get a group of translators that are really trying to be faithful to the text. And I guess the key is underneath what are your sources, okay? Yeah. And that's the key. So, but I think these are all good translations. Some of them aim at more how would I put it, higher education, like the old NEB. It was basically a college education. The NIV is probably someone around 13 years old, because they're trying to communicate. And when you read passages like the Old New English Bible, there's a lot of words that aren't in the general vocabulary of people, but what are you trying to do? Are you trying to communicate, or are you trying to raise up the literacy level? But I think, any of these, I always tell my students, any of these new modern translations are good.
In the Tanakh, why is the book of Daniel included with the writings instead of the prophets? So what features determined how different books were categorized?
Yeah, I'll take that. The Daniel's never called a prophet in the Tanakh. He's a wise man. He's an interpreter of dreams. So essentially, he's placed with the writings, and so from the Tanakh perspective. But we know that for example, in the New Testament, that David is regarded as a prophet, and Daniel is regarded as a prophet because of some of the material, the messages that he gave. predictions that he gave. Jesus talks about Daniel the prophet. But it doesn't necessarily mean, though, therefore, that if someone's called a prophet, that they are to be placed in the prophetic books.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to add something?
Oh, no. Sorry.
Well, yeah. And I think part of it, talking about Daniel as a wise man and the wisdom of Daniel, the wisdom of Daniel's friends, very much he fits in more theological, also his style fits in better with a lot of the wisdom writings. And then when you get to the apocalyptic section, the latter half of Daniel doesn't fit the kind of apocalyptic prophecy that's in there, other than the second half of Zechariah. The second half of Daniel doesn't really fit in with that kind of Israelite, more grounded prophecy than the more expressive and creative and metaphorical apocalyptic prophecy that you see in Zechariah, second half of Daniel, and in John's Revelation.
So, why does there seem to be two different accounts of the creation story in Genesis? So I'm assuming this is the Genesis 1 versus...
Well, we have two accounts of the Exodus. One of them straightforward narrative, and one of them is poetry.
That's what Tim Keller thinks. Says exactly, 14 and 15. Yeah. That's a good answer.
I think that they both get the job done. They just get the job done in different ways.
Interestingly enough, this actually ties into my lecture I gave earlier a little bit. I don't want to say too much about it because it'll could get out of hand very easily. But in talking about the authorship of the Torah, I mentioned briefly about some critical critical scholars and their hypotheses for the formation of the Torah, and the most famous would be the documentary hypothesis. And one of its criteria for dividing source materials within the Torah was variations of style, and there was another one that was contradictions or divergences of views. And it was pointed out that not only do Genesis 1 and 2 demonstrate a variance of style in the way it's talking about Genesis, but they seem to be contradictory accounts and divergent views of creation. Now, obviously I can't, that's a pretty loaded thing to say, and I can't really say too much about that, other than I don't think they are contradictory accounts. I don't think they are divergent views of creation, but I thought of this illustration as I was actually forming my lecture. Originally, as I mentioned, I was going to talk about these criteria for source division from the documentary hypothesis, but for sake of time I couldn't. But with regards to this particular thing, for example, with the Genesis 1 and 2, I think they're better understood as just simply different perspectives on the same truths. One is a broad universal view we find in Genesis 1. It starts with the Lord created the heavens and the earth. And then in Genesis 2, we have a zoom-in shot of the Garden of Eden and the creation of man and man's place in creation. Look at it this way. If I were to go out to a lake with a camera and I were to take a picture of that lake and the surrounding area from several different angles, do all the pictures demonstrate a different lake? Do they demonstrate a different surrounding area? No. No doubt the details in the pictures are going to be different. No two picture will look the same. But they are still reflecting the same lake and the same surrounding area. So I would say that that's the type of thing we have in instances throughout the Torah and other parts of the Old Testament where there seem to be these so-called divergences of view. No, I think they're divergences of perspective. Different perspectives on the same scenery. That's what we have, I would say, in Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah, could you have something for it?
Well, I get in trouble with some people for this. Just in the question as to which is the most misunderstood book in the Old Testament, the answer I had in my head is the book of Genesis. Yeah. And this is where I may not go in line with what a lot of people believe, but in my own thinking in studying such as it has been, to me, Genesis was written to explain the why question, to answer the why question. Why is there a world? Why are there people in the world? Why do we feel separated from God? But it's been since the 20th century that we've sought to use the book to answer the how question. And I don't think that's what the original writers or readers intended. And I think that's caused a lot of problems, just moving from the why to the how. The why question is a theological question. The how question is a scientific question.
Can I add to that? I'll just mention this because I resonate very much with what Richard is saying. Because I find that, for example, many people go to university and they find out that the Earth is, they accept the view that the Earth is a lot older than what the Bible teaches. But is the point of the Bible to teach the age of the Earth, or is the Bible's point to teach us where we came from? And I'll to give you an example. I met an individual in the States. We were having a discussion, and I said to him, if I could prove to you that the Earth was very old, what would that do? He said, I'd lose my faith. Just like that. In other words, and I think Cody actually showed me a debate between two individuals that were talking about this. The issue is not the age of the Earth. The issue is the interpretation of Scripture.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's the key in all this. And I resonate exactly with what Richard says in terms of a lot of the misunderstandings.
Now, this one has to do more with archaeology, we believe. Can you tell the age of a site just by looking at it?
Looking at it with your own bare eyes? No, absolutely not. But we do have some pretty cool ways of generally getting a good understanding of when certain layers, when we can date certain layers. So I didn't bring it up. There's radiocarbon dating, which you can do sometimes if you find organic matter, but it's pretty unlikely that you'll find a whole lot of organic matter. One thing that's really fascinating is that the magnetic pull of the Earth changes over time. When you fire a piece of pottery, it takes a snapshot of what the Earth's magnetism looked like at its time. So if we take a piece of pottery, a broken piece of pottery, we can find out what the magnetic pull looked like when that piece of pottery was fired, and then we can date it from that, which is pretty mind-blowing, for sure. But it's not an exact science. It's pretty fascinating. You can get pretty close. It gets a little tricky if that piece of pottery was then burned by a fire, and a lot of times if there is like just a citywide fire or a marauding army that involves fire as well, so that kind of ruins our chance if we have a strata that's been burned by fire. But without that, that's super fascinating. Other than that, the relative chronology with Egyptian artifacts, that's the best thing you could ever hope for as an archaeologist. If you find any piece of Egyptian art, you can very closely date it as soon as you find one of those.
Just to add to what Cody said, or not Cody, but Anna said, I was just in the ancient history course. I was looking at this shipwreck that was found in 1980 off the coast of Turkey, and there is actually amazing stuff in that. It took them 10 years to basically examine everything in it, and one of the things they found was a little medallion with Nefertiti's image on it, and so they can date this roughly to the about 1350 or so BC based on this. And anyway, but they found 10. This is amazing. They found 10. They found 9. I think a ratio of 10 to 1 in terms of tons of copper and tin. And basically, which is part of the Bronze Age. And so, but incredible trade was happening among all these countries at that time, 1350 BC or so. But there's an example of an Egyptian artifact found on this, as well as other stuff. There's, I think there's hippo teeth there, and ivory and other stuff found on the thing as well.
Sorry, just had like a afterthought about this. So so my background is largely in the sciences, and one of the things that I'll never forget is one of my professors here at Crandall, who still teaches here. He talked about the issue not just in the natural sciences, but this is relevant to the archaeological question too, and something that Dan talked about in his talk this morning is the issue of interpreting the data and of there's some educated when you're dealing with any data having to do with the past, what we call forensics. Right? Who here is familiar with CSI? Okay, I think we're all a little familiar with CSI. You look at the data, try to piece together what happened. This is what we're doing when we look at archaeology. When we look at, as we mentioned, we don't want to get into that because it's pretty off topic from what we've been talking about during the symposium. But the issue of origins and stuff like that, right? There's a reason these debates happen. It's because of the issue of human interpretation of the data with the limited scope of knowledge we have about what actually took place back then. And there are where things are even more complicated by the fact that there are these overlapping predictive realms, wherein different theories of interpreting the data have this huge area. Imagine a Venn diagram where you got the two circles overlapping, right? Now imagine if those circles are really close together so that most of their area were an area of overlap. And there are a lot of specific scenarios where we actually have a lot of overlap between competing theories of how to understand data, not just I'm trying to understand the past, but also some things in the present. But just so you understand the complexity of the issues we're dealing with when we look at archaeology and the sciences and just anything even in historical documentation, when we have conflicting accounts of history and then scant data trying to figure out which account is actually the most accurate to the truth. For example, there are several accounts of why Rome burned, right? Based on other data outside the accounts and on consistency within the accounts, we can try to come up with what's most probable of what took place. But my point is, these aren't easy questions to answer, and there's a reason that these debates happen, whether it's in archaeology or the sciences or just whatever, trying to piece together what happened in the past and sometimes even in the present. It can be very difficult just because the facts are subject to interpretation. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a correct interpretation. There obviously is. That's how reality works. But that's why we're having the dialogue and debate on these issues, is because we're trying to discover what the correct interpretation is together. And that's actually that kind of fits the idea behind the Faith Seeking Understanding Symposium. Just make a little plug there. And just say that what we want to do is promote open dialogue. Even if we have differing views, as you can probably tell, the panelists don't all agree on every single issue, but we want to promote open dialogue on these and try to work together to try to get closer at the truth. So I just want to add that.
All right, so why was a calf skin and not a cow skin used for parchment, such as with the Torah scroll that we have on display?
Thank you. I don't know. I know that cow skins were used. Perhaps it's because the calf skin is more supple or whatever. I don't know. So there you are.
Never mind. I thought of an answer, but it's pretty morbid. So,
so this last question from the audience is directed specifically at Cody. Who do you think the other editor of the Torah was?
Well, obviously, Dr. Stephen Dempster. Now, I'll be speculative here. Okay, I'm going to repeat what I said. We're not told. We don't have documentation telling us who the editor is, but looking at, I categorized the post-Mosaic insertions in 3 categories: biographical insertions, narrative insertions, and contextual insertions. Okay? Biographical narrative insertions, that could be accounted for by Joshua adding to the Torah. He knew Moses, he was an eyewitness to those events. A lot of the contextual assertions come later than Joshua, so there was some sort of post-Joshua editor. Some of them come very late. including, for example, the reference to the kings of Israel. There weren't kings of Israel until 300 years after Joshua, is that right?
Yeah.
Something like that. We're looking at least a 300-year gap. Now, this is where I get a little theological. Right? I try to stay as much away from theology as possible because I was trying to make a story just looking at the textual evidence. But I believe that every author and editor of the Old Testament was inspired by God. Now, we can argue about what we mean by divine inspiration, but I'm going to leave it at that. I do think that the later post-Joshuaic editor was inspired by God. And so when I asked the question, who was the post-Joshuaic editor, if we say there was only one, and I looked through the Old Testament and I try to see who was the most likely candidate, honestly, I would probably conclude it's Ezra the scribe, as late as 1,000 years after Moses and Joshua. Now, my reasons for that is, one, he was a scribe, so I think he's qualified. We know that God did inspire him to write at least one other book, the book of Ezra. And when you look at the context, we have Israel coming out of captivity. The Torah here has been rediscovered. The book of the law of God has been rediscovered. And I don't remember how much time has passed there, but I think that since there wasn't, up to this, there's this gap of knowledge with the nation's familiarity with the Torah and its contents, I think it wouldn't be surprising if Ezra had to make some contextual insertions to make it more accessible to these people living 1,000 years after the fact and who have not had regular access to the Torah. So that's my suspicion. Again, we can't be dogmatic about this. We don't know because we're not told. But that is my suspicion for the contextual insertions. Again, it's possible there was a series of editors. I don't know. But obviously there's at least one post-Joshuaic editor. So I'm going to just say, if there is, I'll take a minimalist perspective and say, if there's just one post-Joshuaic editor, I lean towards Ezra the scribe. So I don't know if anybody else has a thought on that.
Yeah, in my research, they're talking about the anachronisms between archaeology and what's written in the Bible, and Longman, Long, and Proven. Sorry, messes me up every time. They talk about how these anachronisms make sense if we understand them as late monarchic additions to the text. So late monarchic, we're talking potentially, I've seen it thrown around Hezekiah, that during Hezekiah's reforms and rediscovery of Torah and trying to disseminate that among the people, that Hezekiah was involved in not just a religious form, but also a little bit of textual reform as well. But again, that's incredibly speculative. It would make sense if it was late monarchic or even post-exilic. Either one of those kind of work. But yeah, we have really no solid evidence in any direction.
That's what I think of as Steve Dempster.
Just one final thought on that. I do think that what Cody has said, and I don't disagree with Dan, but what Cody has said, though, I think by the time of the completion of the Torah, the final edition of the Torah, we talked about this earlier, but there are editions of the Torah. I think John Sailheimer used to talk about Pentateuch 1.0, Pentateuch 2.0. And I think that there's a truth to there, and I think that at the very ending of the Torah, there's an awareness that a long, long line of prophets have come and gone, and no one measures up to Moses. At the end of the prophets, you get this idea of remember the Torah and the prophet who's going to come, Elijah, before the great. So there's an awareness, I think, of the age of prophecy is gone. And now it's the age of wisdom where we study and we come to our understanding. And you find this that is sort of backed up in some of the literature, intertestamental literature, where the rabbis, and also you see the Maccabees, they're waiting for a prophet to arise that'll tell them things. And then you see it in some of the rabbinic sayings that the Holy Spirit has disappeared from Israel or whatever, is not speaking, we don't have prophets. And Josephus, who basically says that the canonical books that we have there are no more editions because of the failure of the exact succession of the prophets. There's an awareness that prophecy is ceased. So I think that's got to play into it. Yeah.
So for the last 20 or so minutes, we will now be having the speakers ask each other questions.
Surprise!
I get a question.
The pastor.
I heard recently, and I can't remember, I read it or it was on the radio, that there is, the person speaking said that there was zero archaeological evidence for the Israelite community to have wandered through the desert for the 40 years that they're claiming to, and that therefore the whole story is fictional.
Yeah, that's good. I've heard that too, and I not recently, but when you think about it, you're dealing with 603,550 adults, males, and so you're talking about 2 million. You're going to leave evidence somewhere for that. Now the issue is there's a number of issues there. They wandered. They didn't stay very long in different places, but you think there was evidence. I think that those numbers, though, are more symbolic than real. Not that. Let me put it this way: not that they could be real, because God can work miracles, and we know, for example, the population of Quebec. They had the same kind of theological background, etc., in terms of large families and things. From the 1700s we have the same kind of numbers that you have in Israel, which would have taken 400 years to reach those numbers. Now, but the thing is, when you actually look at the evidence and that kind of thing, I think Dan mentioned it. It's this issue of the word 1,000. It's the word Aleph, which can mean unit. And if you have an army of 600, for example, of 600,000 adult males, no one is going to stand against you. I don't care. In the ancient world, no one's going to stand against you.
There's
the
no
largest
such thing as standing army.
The largest army that we're aware of in the ancient world is the Assyrians had about 100,000 at one time. And that's very late. So those numbers, they're not to be I don't think they're to be understood literally. And as a result, so it's much smaller than that. And I don't know, a person that's done a lot of writing on this in terms of the numbers is Hoffmeyer, the Egyptologist, in that. So I that would be an issue. I mean, if there's 2 million, they're going to leave some kind of evidence there. But the issue of archaeological evidence too, it's a lot of absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence.
No.
You know, I mean that's a thing. So that's what I would say. That's how I would respond. I don't know if that helps at all. Did you or not?
I'd add to that. If we take the story at face value, and we're told that even the soles of the shoes and the garments of the people as they wandered around for those 40 years, not even they wore out. So the only things they're leaving, remember, they're not building houses, they're only setting up tents every once in a while, other than accidentally, Sally left her doll in the desert again. Well, we're not going back for it this time. The only things that they're leaving in the desert is what Cody was talking about, where they had to have specific laws about their toiletries and how they did their business. That's the only thing they're leaving in the desert, is what they dig into the ground. And a few bodies that get left here and there. In which case, I mean, you're leaving corpses out in the desert. They're put in proper graves, obviously. potentially they were put in proper graves. For all we know, they could have been, they would have just been buried somewhere in the sand, in which case sand moves. Those bones would have gotten turned, they would have gotten destroyed. These are not properly, these were not bones like in Egypt when they were put in sarcophagi. These are, I mean, they're probably not cutting down a whole lot of trees in the wilderness to give them proper coffins. These remains are long gone. We shouldn't expect to find, again, especially if we bring the numbers down from 2 million to a couple 100,000. A couple 100,000 people walking around in the desert for only 40 years, never building houses, never producing much material culture. You shouldn't expect to find much, really, if anything at all.
This kind of reminds me of a question that was asked during one of my courses in my early graduate studies career. One of the students in class asked the prof, why are the Gospels dated so much later than the life of Christ, in terms of is there a gap at all? Like, why didn't the Gospel writers just take to writing this stuff down as soon as it happened? And the prof just bluntly answers, like, the disciples were being persecuted and on the run, so they were a little busy. Now, I share that because in terms of there being, to me that's a funny question, and maybe this is just reflecting my own naivety. But yeah, the Israelites were a nomadic desert tribe at this time. Why should we expect to find any substantial archaeological evidence for them? They were on the move. They weren't settling anywhere. Like, their place of worship was a tent. Like Dan said, besides what they were burying in the ground and maybe Sally's doll getting left behind, I don't think we would expect to find much. I think it's kind of an odd demand to put on that. So, yes,
I have a question to ask Richard, actually, more than anything else. I was really intrigued by that sense of exile, and you see how would I put it, the stamp, the exilic stamp. There's a scholar who's written a book called The Death and Resurrection of Israel, Donald Gowan, and it's on the prophets, and he talks about how that exilic stamp, you see that Assyrian exile, you see that also the Babylonian exile and stamp. But I was really intrigued more by your sense of exile larger than that, and I couldn't help but think of things like the story of the prodigal son, you know, in the New Testament and places like that, and Jesus sort of calling a new Israel in the 12 disciples. He's a new Israel called out of exile or whatever. But I was thinking about how you must, as a pastor, think about the sense of exile. I'm not thinking so much of the church, but I'm thinking of of if it's true, like Genesis 2 and 3, is there this sense of exile that we see in human beings? You know what I mean? Like this idea that we're not, how would I put it? We're not at home. We're lost, you know. And I just wanted to speak to that as a pastor, and you're working with people and that kind of thing.
Yes, well, certainly there's a theological dimension to exile, in the sense of a spirit in exile from God, and needing to, the whole message of the Bible is that we can have a relationship with God and come out of exile in that sense. I'm also, you're talking about coming home, I'm also reminded of the African American experience during the time of slavery, with a lot of the great African spirituals, with the theme of coming home and finding a place with God in the midst of their exile out of Africa, and actually exile out of personhood, because they were not regarded as fully persons. And I think there is, Doug Horstman and I were talking about this a little bit, there's just huge potential for the language of exile to be understood on a personal level, on a family level, a church level, a citywide, provincial, all the way up to a world level. And recognizing that I think almost all of those levels are found in the scriptures. And if we can have eyes to see and ears to hear, the potential for great theological insights.
I was mentioning to others a book that resonated with me as you were talking about the margins, because you back to the first century. This book by a New Testament scholar, Larry Hurtado, I had my New Testament students read. It's called Destroyer of the Gods. And his question, and it's based on Polycarp's view that, Polycarp, when he was being martyred for his faith at the age of 87, being burned alive, the story goes that they yelled at him, "You're a destroyer of the gods." In other words, because he believed in only one God. But Hurtado takes that up and he says, why is it that you get a group which is a sect within Judaism, which is sociologists say by the end of the first century is 10,000, by the end of the second century is 200,000, by the end of the third century is 6 million. How can you account for that growth? Given the fact there's no political advantage at all, there's no social advantage at all, there's not any real advantage, but what is the advantage? What is the attraction? There is something deep there that you need to explain, and perhaps it's this sense of we are home, we're at peace. I liked what you said there, the second thing about this call to live differently, because I was talking to my sister there, Cadeau, and she was telling me about her conversion story. She met someone at U to M who she said lived so differently that she was attracted to what and it was Natalie Martin who has taught here, and that I just sorry about but it's an amazing story. But it was specifically dealing with that second point. She saw someone different, and that made all the difference in the world for her.
If I could add just one thing too, is sociologically, the early church was largely a lower class movement, and the growth of the early church occurred in the lower classes because it was in the church that they could find equality.
Yeah.
And huge swaths of the poorest of the poor flocked to the church. In fact, there's a story told of a rich man who comes to faith in Jesus Christ in the first or second century. And he comes to the first church service, and all the seats are taken, so he's encouraged to sit down on the floor. And he looks, and his slave is there. And so he says to the pastor, "Well, I can't sit there. My slave is there." And the pastor smiled and said, "That's okay. Sit."
And he said, "Well,
You don't understand. That's my slave." "Yeah, I know. Sit." "But you're asking me to sit with my slave." The pastor said, "Yes." And it was then that the rich man understood that all of these class distinctions were obliterated in the early church. And it's unfortunate now, in some ways, that the church has become largely a middle-class movement, and the lower classes don't feel they have a part in it quite often.
okay, go ahead.
Sort of a follow-up question to that. What would be your word? My church has been kind of talking about a lot lately. We've kind of just de facto become a church full of immigrants. We haven't really done anything for it. It just kind of happened. And how would you? What words of encouragement? What passages would you point to those immigrants to Canada? I mean, we're such an immigrant-focused immigration-focused country. Those who are coming here, they're in a new world. They're in a new country where they don't speak the language, and it's a foreign culture, and it's a foreign way of doing things. And even they might be coming to church, and yes, we're worshiping the same Jesus, but it's a very different way of worshiping Jesus than what they're used to in their home cultures, in their home churches. What words of encouragement would you give as their pastor to say, yes, you are in geopolitical exile, but here you find home in this church? What sort of words would you give?
Well, we've had a similar experience in our own church, is that almost in spite of ourselves, we've become an intercultural congregation. And in fact, I met with the internationals in our church just a few weeks ago. And I think one of the mistakes that we've made is we've been asking them, how can we serve you? And when I met with them, they want to be doing ministry. They don't always want to be served. And the challenge that they really put to us, and they put it bluntly, put us to work. And as far as scripture passages go, I've discovered I don't need to be sharing scripture with them. I need to be hearing the scriptures that are meaningful to them. There's a book I read several years ago that was so, I was in my 20s, I think it was, and it was so influential to me. It was called Reading the Bible Through Third World Eyes. And that talked about how the passages that we in the Western world tend to spiritualize, those in poor countries will take them very literally and will interpret much differently from the way we do. And just learning about the passages that are meaningful to them, how they interpret them, what they mean to them, we have a lot to learn.
I have a question. Why are we doing for time?
About 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, we'll make this a closing question because I think it's an appropriate one, and it's. I'd like to hear Richard answer it first, but it's more for all of us. I want to get all our thoughts on this, but I'll let Richard answer first because it's related to his lecture. In light of the fact that the church is a people in exile in the modern culture, I think of some more liberal scholars who would say things like Christianity needs to change or die, right? I've spoken to some people that say that Christianity, I speak broadly here, biblical Christianity is completely irrelevant to the world today. You can't try to change the culture. You just need to allow Christianity and the church to adapt to the culture if it's going to survive. So, in light of what you talked about, and in light of doing an event like the Faith Seeking Understanding Symposium, how would you respond to that way of thinking? And then I think it'd be appropriate. Maybe I'd like to hear the other speakers' thoughts on that too.
Well, I still tend to be, and everything is relative, but from a world perspective, to be very conservative in my thinking. And I believe that there is an unchanging gospel that needs to be communicated relevantly to people. But I've seen, and I guess I can say this because my family's background is in the United Church of Canada. When I see where the United Church has gone, seeking to be relevant to their culture, and they're now looking at whether it's okay for a United Church pastor to be an atheist. It says to me that they've lost their way. They've gone into exile and they've lost their way, and that's always a danger for the church. The church can, like I was talking about, try to get back to where it was, or while it's in exile, it can lose its way. And I'm thinking that a church that's on the margins, but yet remains true to the essentials of the Christian faith that have been handed down for centuries, that there is great power there, and that may be where God wants us to be.
I don't know if this was originally going to be part of your message, but I've been asked this question: how do we function as Christians in post-Christian Canada? And I wear a lot of hats. When I'm not a professor, I'm also a preacher. And the story that always comes to mind for me is the very beginning of Daniel. And Daniel is asked by the king's officials, you need to be you're the best and brightest of Israel. You need to now be the best and brightest in Babylon. You need to serve this tyrant king that killed your parents. Now it's time for you to work for him in middle management, which would be an unbearable task. You now have your boss is now the person that made sure your parents died, and their response is kind of twofold. On the one hand, they were accommodating to culture. They were accommodating to cultural norms. They say, okay, yes, I've got to learn the Babylonian language. I need to know the Babylonian culture, which culture and religion are inseparable at that time. So I have to know the Babylonian creation myth, which runs contrary to my understanding of how the world was created. So I have to know the secular or the pagan or my culture's the worldview of my culture. I have to understand that worldview so I can function within that worldview. However, me and my friends, we are not going to eat the king's food. We'll play by the king's rules, but we're not going to eat his food. We will function within his system so long as that system does not contradict our ethics, our morals, our spirituality. So finding that balance of knowing what you can bend on and say, you know what, this piece, Scripture is kind of agnostic towards it, doesn't really care where you stand on this issue. This is an issue where Scripture has a strong stance, and I need to uphold that stance. So finding that balance and calling untruth when you need to, obviously in a loving way, speaking the truth in love. But yeah, knowing when to say, okay, this doesn't really affect my Christian beliefs. You doing you doesn't affect my Christian beliefs. This cultural understanding, this postmodernism has some bad things for us as Christians. This rejection of big, grand narratives, big religious explanations of the world. It also has some really great things that we're now open to spiritual expressions. We're open to thinking outside of the physical box. We're open to metaphysics. That's good. We can take that good stuff and we can work with it. As the church has done throughout the millennium, we take what's good out of culture. I've heard it described as plundering the Egyptians, going back to the Torah. When the Israelites left Egypt, it's described that the Israelites plundered Egypt as they went. And you know what they used all those gold artifacts for that they plundered from the Egyptians? Most of them were probably pagan artifacts. They built a tabernacle with it. They took things that were not just secular, but explicitly pagan. They melted them down, used the raw resources out of that to make something beautiful and holy out of.
Yes, and I would just simply say that the stories of Daniel, I appreciate the story of Esther that you shared, and Richard too, and the story of Joseph in Egypt, how the empire, Walter Brueggemann has said, the empire has ran out of answers to the problems. But who comes but an Israelite, Joseph, who is able, with his wisdom, to be able to save not only Egypt, but the rest of the known world at the time. So you get this idea. But I think, too, of real failures. And I think of the German church in the Nazi period, which basically compromised and and basically lost its soul, really. And it was people like Bonhoeffer now that were very much minorities, but that were able to see prophetically what Hitler was. And I think, why was he able to do that? I think that he lived the gospel in his own life. We read about the cost of discipleship, but he was able to, and he ultimately paid with his life. But where are we going to, we need to know what hill to die on. I guess that's wisdom. But when that hill comes, we have to be willing to die on it. And when you talk about the irrelevance of Scripture, all you have to do to me is to read the Sermon on the Mount. And it's not irrelevant, it's revolutionary, actually. It's revolutionary. And it's based on the Old Testament. And you look at passages like, and I haven't dealt with this at all, but if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, and how radically counter-narrative they are to the cultures, this is really what God's ideal was. And of course, when you're reading the rest of the Bible, you're in that valley, where God has to work with a not ideal situation. And so you're going to get a lot of these laws which aren't ideal, but they're trying to move it in a certain direction. And but no, I think that when we're, we need to be relevant to God. And then as we're relevant to God, we can be relevant to the world. Anyway.
I'd like to just say one more very quick thing, is the other side of the compromise that we've been talking about is the complete rejection of the culture. And if I had time, that's what Jonah did. And you can understand it when you understand that Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and they were the ones who had sent Jonah and his fellow Israelites into exile. So of course he hated them. And so he wanted to just have God obliterate them, and yet God is saying, I love them, I want you to call them to repent. And we have to recognize that as far off course as our culture is, we are not to reject the culture out of hand, but we are to recognize that they're a mission field and seek to call them to repentance. Did I say one thing?
This is something I want to wrap up with, because I like all three you said there, and that's kind of just to kind of pull that together. I think there's two things that come to mind with this. One is something I talked about earlier, the symposium. Christians' characterization by Christ as the salt of the earth and light of the world. By nature, salt is different from the medium from which it's put in, and by nature, light is different from the darkness from which in which it shines. So there's always going to be a difference between the church and culture. I don't think we should compromise the culture, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything good in the culture to work with. I think of Acts, and this is my second thing. I think of I think of Paul in Acts 17, verses 36 to 34, where he delivers where he's in Athens and he's talking to people, witnessing to them in the marketplace or in the synagogue, and he gets called to come and share his views at the Areopagus, all the high intellects. And what he does is fascinating. Is he draws, there's two quotes in there from pagan Greek philosophers who Paul draws from to say, look, this is some of the stuff you guys got right, but this is why it makes better sense within a Christian context. So I think from an apologetics and evangelistic perspective, just adding on to what these three have said, I think we need to recognize the fact that we are always going to be different from the culture. There is always going to be a difference between biblical Christianity and the culture. But that does not mean there's nothing good in the culture to work with. And I think we need to be like Paul and note the things that are right and then work from there. So that's my closing thought on that. But I know we need to wrap things up, and so I'll give it back to Mark.
All right. So that's essentially it for the questions section. So, I'd like to thank Daryl Nevers for promoting this event. For the first MC who couldn't be here today, Dr. John Olhauser. All of you guys for attending. as well as the speakers we have here, Dr. Stephen Dempster, Daniel Cooper, Reverend Dr. Richard Jackson, and Cody Guitar. Do we still have time to share the final thoughts?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So if you guys would like to share your closing thoughts on the symposium, the mic's yours. Oh, or I can hand this
I'll share my final thoughts, and he will never do this himself, but I do want to say that Cody Guitar is doing an amazing work for Ratio Christi, and the one that is here is the only Ratio Christi organization in Canada. He is pioneering it, and like many missionaries, he is dependent upon the goodwill of supporters. And if you remember the statistics I gave as to for younger people, less than 10% are involved in a church. What he's doing on the campus here is hugely important. So if any of you or your churches feel led to offer either one-time support or monthly support to Cody, I know that he'll use every dollar in a very strategic way, and he won't say that himself. So I just wanted to take a moment to do that.
I would just echo thoughts about Cody and how he is CDO, not so OCD. But if you had seen all the emails I've had in the last 2 years, it's amazing though, but he's done an immense amount of work. And I'd just like to really thank him for doing this, Cody. And I mean, this is, when we think about, you have seen something which people don't get the opportunity to see here, this Torah scroll from 1750, a brand plucked from the burning, actually, literally, as Amos would describe it. And I just can't think about how we're talking about the Old Testament, and we hear about the synagogue today, and those that have been killed, and also the singe marks on this because it was saved from crystal knot. You know, we live in an interesting time. All I would just say, to me, the Old Testament is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of Jesus Christ, and so I just feel a great privilege here to be involved in this this event with the likes of these men.
Well, I'm incredibly thankful to be here, to have an opportunity for me as a junior scholar to do really anything with my scholarship. Anytime I ever get to do anything with my scholarship is a real treat for me as a junior scholar, so I'm very thankful to be here. I'm very thankful for Cody to bring me on for, not only is he doing what he's doing for Radio Christi, but he's just a solid guy around campus. He's between him and Dr. Dempster and a number of the other professors here, this place has been very welcoming. It's been interesting seeing how welcoming this school is. I saw it as a student when I was here, and now I'm seeing it as a new faculty member. And so being able to be part of this has been part of that welcoming process for me here at Crandall. And I'm very thankful that that people came out to listen to me talk, even though I'm really a nobody, especially compared to some others that spoke. Very thankful for some of the really interesting questions and participation, some of the questions here at the table and earlier. And thankful that Ratio Christi's empowering Cody for doing this, that he has this passion here, and we're able to get this scroll that is, again, just beautiful, in both visually, but its story is beautiful, really, really touching. So thank you all so much for coming and being a part of this.
Well, I promise you that wasn't scripted. I did not ask them to say those nice things about me, but it means a lot.
Even if they be enough to say that.
No, it does mean a lot. As anything, I didn't do this alone. This was a lot of hard work, many hands in the pot over the course of many months. I think, Steve, we only really started making plans and booking things. It was just at the end of last semester, right? Something like that. Because it was mostly brainstorming and stuff before then, because we ran into some issues trying to figure out how to get the scroll up here. But yeah, no, that was kind of one of the two centerpieces where I got that and Steve Dempster. I joked to Dr. Olhauser last night that really when you think about it, it's really cool because we have two artifacts at this event. We have a 300-year-old scroll and a 60-some-year-old Steve Dempster, so that's pretty exciting. But no, I love Steve. I really consider him to be a bit of a spiritual and even scholarly mentor for me in recent years. And I love his heartfulness, and I'm very thankful for Richard. He's the pastor at the church that my wife and I attend, and I'm really glad he could be a part of this. And I'm really thankful for Dan. Our friendship goes back to about 7 years ago? 8 years ago?
2011?
Yeah, 2011. We were in a play together. That's how we met. He wore a kilt. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Yeah, no, it's meant a lot to get to work alongside these guys and make this event happen for all of you and for all of you watching at home. Our heart for this is one of service, and it was really, believe us when we tell you, it is very much that we just want to see people get equipped. We want to see people come to a deeper and more vibrant understanding of their faith. We want to see people feel more confident in their ability to share it, and also better equipped in their ability to defend it. Those were the three purposes of the symposium, and I hope you feel that we helped to meet all three of those purposes in our series of lectures and our Q&A, and the time you got to speak at the lectures in between talks and stuff. But in closing, I just wanted to say that there's not much more I can say in that. We just really want to serve you guys. And if you want to see more things like this, I come talk to us. We'd be happy. I can only speak for myself, but I have a sense that I'm sure these guys would also be happy if you ever wanted to get them speaking at your church on something or whatever. If you had more questions for them, I'm sure they'd be willing to help you find answers to those. Yeah, and I'm going to just ask the question. I'm curious. Would you guys be interested if we did this as an annual thing?
Woo!
The awkward nods, just everybody's just like, I don't want to say anything because I don't want to be that one person.
Like it on Facebook.
Yes.
Like it on Facebook and share the videos.
Yes, like on Facebook, share the videos. Just so you guys know, every single person, and again, they might not, some of them might not say this themselves. Every single person involved in the symposium were volunteers. We did this without any budget. Now, that being said, if you are interested in helping make the symposium a bigger thing next time around, come talk to me later. But in any case, in the meantime, I just want to let you know that I just hope you see that when we really put our minds to it, with the resources that God has blessed us with, we can do some pretty God-glorifying things. And I really hope that we accomplish that with the Faith Seeking Understanding Symposium this weekend. So with that, I would like to take the liberty to close us in prayer, and then we are going to part ways until, who knows, maybe next time around.
Can I just say something super
yes.
quick for the viewers at home? Stick around after the prayer, and I will walk you over for a live stream of the scroll so that you can get an up-close look.
Oh, wow, they're getting spoiled. All right, let's close in word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the privilege, the opportunity we have to come together so freely, so openly in your name, to learn about you and your word and how we can better understand it, how we can share it, and how we can readily answer questions and objections about it, and the faith which springs out of it, and out of the God-man, Jesus Christ. And Lord, I thank you for everybody who's been involved in the symposium. I lost count of how many people at one point or another were involved in whether it was the planning or anything else, but and we have so many volunteers this week. And just thank you, Lord, for everyone's heart of ministry here, for the heart of service, and most importantly, for their love and passion for you and for those around them. The two great commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And we pray, Lord, that as we do events like this, even though that they are, academic in nature and very practical and stuff, I hope that as we do these things, people will see the love that went into this. The love and concern for others, for each other as brothers and sisters in the Lord, and for those in the outside world, in the culture. And most importantly, Lord, we pray that in all we've done this weekend, that we glorified you, and that in some way, shape, or form, we edified those who, that you edified those through us. That people who heard the lectures, who were part of our discussions, that they were edified in some way. That this may somehow play a part in the furtherance of your kingdom. And we pray all this in the glorious name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so this is the Torah scroll. It is about 300 years old. Starts over there, goes all the way over there. I have been told that it is about 93 feet long. Steve Dempster did a talk yesterday. He was talking about how it was made, and so the material is parchment, which is calf skin that has been stretched and dried and then stitched together. You can see the stitches using, I guess, a part of the intestines of the animal. You can see, I'll try to get close, some of this kind of scorch marks along the edges. Some of the edges of where it got close to the fire. And one of the interesting things, and the reason we have it rolled out to where it is now, is that over here we have an example of Hebrew poetry, and you can see how it differs in the format of its composition. I can't tell you all the technicalities, but you can see that it is very, very clearly written differently, and this is in Exodus. I cannot tell you exactly where, but it is in Exodus. So I'll go slowly by these as well so that you can see them. You can go back, pause, read them if you want to. But I wanted to give you guys an up-close look since you tuned in from afar.
They make vows that they won't commit adultery, these kinds of things. And they
Next video?
so this is early. This is
And of course, it's written in Hebrew, which is written the opposite way of how we write English. So that means that it's written from right to left instead of left to right. So over there is Genesis, over there is the rest of the Torah. And I think these are some different tools that people can use to follow along. I'm not really sure. Magnifying glasses, they're cool.
Peter Reed. Yeah, he's in our church, and I've been talking to him, and just completely separate from the church.
Ashkenazi Torah scroll means that it is the entirety of the Torah altogether and comes from the Ashkenazi
This
region.
whole idea of the convention in exile and what that means. So
yeah.
it seems to be something
That's
that
it.
God is just
Thanks for tuning in for the conference, everybody.
what you